Study of the Family, Goldberg's book, Therapy and Overview. Bowen Family Systems Theory is a theory of human behavior that views the family as an emotional unit and uses systems thinking to describe the complex interactions in this unit. It is the nature of a family that its members are intensely connected emotionally. Families so profoundly affect their members' thoughts, feelings, and actions that it often seems as if people are living under the same emotional skin. People solicit each other's attention, approval, and support, and react to each other's needs, expectations, and upsets. Connectedness and reactivity make the functioning of family members interdependent. A change in one person's functioning is predictably followed by reciprocal changes in the functioning of others. The emotional interdependence presumably evolved to promote the cohesiveness and cooperation families require to protect, shelter, and feed their members. Heightened tension, however, can intensify these processes that promote unity and teamwork, and this can lead to problems. When family members get anxious, the anxiety can escalate by spreading infectiously among them. As anxiety goes up, the emotional connectedness of the family members become more stressful than comforting. The individual who does the most accommodating literally absorbs system anxiety, and thus is the family member most vulnerable to problems such as depression, alcoholism, affairs, or physical illness. The emotional system affects most human activity and is the principal driving force in the development of clinical problems. Knowledge of how the emotional system operates in one's family, work, and social systems reveals new and more effective options for solving problems in each of these areas. The 8 core concepts of Bowen Family Systems theory are emotional triangles, differentiation of self, nuclear family systems, family projective process, multi-generational transmission process, emotional cutoff, sibling position, and societal emotional process. A triangle is a 3-person relationship system. It is considered the building block of larger emotional systems because the triangle is the smallest stable relationship system. A 2-person system is unstable because it tolerates little tension before involving a third person. A triangle can contain much more tension without involving another person because the tension can shift around 3 relationships. If the tension is too high for one triangle to contain, it spreads to a series of interlocking triangles. Spreading the tension can stabilize the system, but nothing gets resolved. The patterns in a triangle change with increasing tension. In calm periods, 2 people are comfortably close insiders, and a third person is an uncomfortable outsider. The insiders actively exclude the outsider, and the outsider works to get closer to one of them. Someone is always uncomfortable in a triangle and pushing for change. Differentiation of self. The basic building blocks of the self are inborn, but an individual's family relationships during childhood and adolescence primarily determine how much self they develop. Once established, the level of self rarely changes unless a person makes a structured and long-term effort to change. People with a poorly differentiated self depend so heavily on the acceptance and approval of others that they quickly adjust to what they think, say, and do to please others. Or they dogmatically proclaim what others should be like and pressure them to conform. The concept of the nuclear family emotional system describes 4 basic relationship patterns that govern where problems develop in the family. People's attitudes and beliefs about relationships play a role in the patterns, but the forces primarily driving them are part of the emotional system. The 4 basic relationship patterns are marital conflict, dysfunction in one spouse, impairment of one or more children, and emotional distance. The family projection process describes the primary way parents transmit their emotional problems to a child. The projection process can impair the functioning of one or more children and increase their vulnerability to clinical symptoms. Children inherit many types of problems as well as strengths through the relationships with their parents. The problems children inherit that most affect their lives are relationship sensitivities, such as heightened need for attention and approval, difficulty dealing with expectations, the tendency to blame oneself or others, and feeling responsible for the happiness of others, or that others are responsible for their own happiness. The concept of the multi-generational transmission process describes how small differences in the levels of differentiation between parents and their offspring lead over many generations to marked differences in differentiation among the members of the multi-generational family. The information creating these differences is transmitted across generations through relationships. The transmission occurs on several interconnected levels, ranging from the conscious teaching and learning of information to automatic and unconscious programming of emotional reactions and behaviors. The concept of emotional cutoff describes people managing their unresolved emotional issues with parents, siblings, and other family members by reducing or totally cutting off emotional contact with them. Emotional contact can be reduced by people moving away from their families and really going home, or it can be reduced by people staying in physical contact with their families but avoiding sensitive issues. Relationships may look better if people cut off to manage them, but the problems are dormant and unresolved. People who grow up in the same sibling position predictably have important common characteristics. The characteristics of one position are not better than those of another, but rather are complementary. Each concept in Bowen theory applies to non-family groups such as work and social organizations. The concept of societal emotional process describes how the emotional system governs behavior on a societal level, promoting both progressive and regressive periods in society. Goals of treatment include understanding the family emotional system, observing and recognizing family patterns, reducing anxiety and relieving symptoms, restoring trust and fairness, increasing differentiation, and demonstrating intergenerational patterns. Some interventions include teaching differentiation, focusing on thinking more than feeling, detriangulating by reducing dyadic interactions, encouraging I statements, reopening cutoff relations, and guiding families to identify triggers for reactivity. That's the end of our brief overview for Bowen Family Systems Therapy.
All right. Class is over. That's all you need to know. I'm just kidding. So any comments, questions about that before so everything that you just heard, we're going to go into more detail on each of those aspects. So if something felt too fast, too brief, too vague, we'll pop into it some more. But any initial questions to maybe help guide me in the information that I'll be providing you? Okay. Everything was clear. Okay, so we'll hop into some history here. I do also please remind me, I've been forgetting to do this when we've covered other approaches, but I'm really interested in your feedback on the readings, lengthwise, content, all of that kind of stuff. Okay, so starting with Bowen family evaluation, essentially Bowen noticed that the reason that this is called natural family systems is this emotional system that he coined, the term he coined, he saw existing in all forms of life. So this theory is based on the assumption that the human is a product of evolution and that human behavior is significantly regulated by nature and these natural processes that regulate all behavior in living things. So he thought humans are really no exception to this. And as we saw, we read it about lizards and turtles and bears and all that kind of stuff that he believed that humans are more like other living creatures as opposed to unique from them. And then Bowen did a lot of his studying and his learning, working with families where one member had schizophrenia. So he kind of coined that families can differ quantitatively So of course, looking at that differentiation scale that we'll talk about a little bit later, but not so much qualitatively, and that there's a little bit of schizophrenia in all of us. So I'm curious what any of you came to understand he meant by that. So when Bowen said there's a little schizophrenia in all of us, what did he mean by that?
Is he referring to the multi-generational transmission process?
In part, yep.
Well,
What-
I think,
Yeah, there.
Keep going.
go ahead, Sarah.
No, I'm done.
Go ahead. Okay,
I
Justine,
think
is that you?
Yeah, I
Okay.
think he said when he meant there is a little schizophrenia in all of us, if the presenting problem in an emotional unit is anxiety and schizophrenia is the presenting problem of anxiety that we all experience through, whether that be through the intergenerational process or our own, what does he talk about? Like our own scale on the differentiation level. So we all experience a little schizophrenia due to it almost being impossible that any of us would be at 100 points for differentiation.
We'll keep putting this together. George, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I think the most charitable thing to say about it is he had a profoundly different view of schizophrenia than has developed over time. And maybe he just uses it really as a shorthand for craziness. But he's really looking at what he sees as processes which he thought gave rise to the emergence of schizophrenic symptoms or behaviors. But he saw those same processes in so-called normal families.
Sure. Thank you.
But I
Brianna?
think his thinking was backwards on this.
Okay.
But that there's a little bit of normal in schizophrenic families would probably be a more accurate statement.
Okay. What do you think his purpose was in saying it the way that he did, as opposed to the way that you just posed it?
Well, again, I think he had a very different understanding of schizophrenia and where it came from and how to cure it. And I think he was trying to probably share that insight that, hey, these are people too, and they can, don't be afraid of them and stuff like that.
Sure.
But I think he was also trying to be provocative.
True to the times and all of the other founders of these or creators of these approaches that we've learned about so far. Thank you. Brianna.
Yeah, so the way I kind of interpreted it was when he was looking at patients who were diagnosed with schizophrenia, he was looking at the relationship between them and their mother. And I was thinking more so when he says that there's a little bit of it of us, like how the relationship could increase symptoms or decrease depending on within the family system. Kind of like how I looked at it. So like the inner relationships and how that has an impact.
Yeah, thank you. Caitlin.
I'm quite nervous to share my feelings about this.
Well, thank you for taking a risk.
Or I'm like, if I can articulate it. I think I'm kind of where Sarah is, and I'm wondering if, and I can't think of the other person who kind of talks about this. There's another like philosopher that talks about like society is created like schizophrenia and the way that all the different systems. And I'm wondering if like societal regression that Bowen talks about, and because he's so naturally based, right? And like everything's so natural, but then when you add society in or you add capitalism in there, right? It's gonna create boundaries and it's going to create issues and tension where anxiety is going to become part of it. That also can get transferred down over generations, but that it's going to create a level of schizophrenia almost in all of us. And so I think for me, it ties a little bit into societal regression. So that's just kind of what I made of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Justine.
Yeah, I think to incorporate kind of what Brianna was saying, when he talks about there's a little schizophrenia in all of us, I think he refers to this relationship or balance between togetherness and individuality.
Mhm.
And as Brianna had mentioned, they use the example of how between the mother and son, and when the child is developmentally growing up and forming his own differentiation, he talks about schizophrenia in terms of the togetherness of the child and the mother is not diffused. Therefore, it's this constant battle between individuality and togetherness that will create a little bit of the schizophrenia within us all.
Great. Thank you, Justine. Juliana.
From how I understand it is a little bit of what everyone has said. And while he was working with children that had suffered from schizophrenia, he would see their family, the family of these children, and sort of find where the linkage could be with whatever was the dysfunction of the family that either showcased these symptoms or created these symptoms, and that's kind of how I understood that. He linked and found the differentiation, the emotional linkage and triangulation, and all of these may have been some of the ingredients that he was connecting with the children that were suffering from schizophrenia.
Thank you. Tiffany.
For me, I think the focus was more so on not necessarily the individual, but as the family, hence the quantitative versus quality of each individual. And so because of and same thing, piggybacking off of what everyone else has said, instead of looking at the diagnosis in one, it's looking at the attributes of all, where's the quantity.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany. Carolyn.
Yeah, something that also came up for me was R.D. Laing, which is the divided self, and his theory of schizophrenia, and how a lot of these guys' psychosis reactions are to an intolerable external world. So you create like a dissociation from yourself and your own body, so a sense of safety from those external systems.
Great. Yeah. So my understanding is that the family dynamics, these patterns, that this emotional system that exists within a family, remember Bowen talking about the solid self and the pseudo self due to accommodation. So the emotional system is inherent within a family system. So when an individual that is affected by the anxiety, this emotional system is very accommodating and absorbs a lot of the anxiety and the emotional intensity within the system, they lose a little bit more and a little bit more of themselves, which is a very common experience within family systems. So schizophrenia is a potential result of all of the 8 interlocking factors, or what's the word I'm looking for? Things within the Bowen system, the sibling position, multi-generational transmission process, all of these things, where this is a symptom of all of these processes. And it's a result of this accommodation where the pseudo self essentially takes over, which essentially everybody is vulnerable to. So to your point, George, of the possibility of some normalization of this, some taking away some of the stigma around schizophrenia, my understanding is that it's this process and this result of a process that anybody has the possibility of experiencing. Questions, comments about that? Okay.
Well, if I may,
Yeah, of course.
reading this and, reviewing family evaluation, it seems to me if Bowen built this whole notion on what is now, in my understanding, a largely discredited notion of what schizophrenia is and how it arises, what does this do for the rest of it?
Mm.
You know, and that bothered me a lot in reading this. And I know we'll get to the critique down the end, so I don't want to steal all your thunder, but just while we're on the topic, you know.
Sure. So say a little bit more about, if you can elaborate a little bit more, George, about it being discredited, our understanding of schizophrenia.
Well, so at least in my understanding of it, and in the schizophrenics or people with schizophrenia, I should say, that I work with, schizophrenia is largely thought now to be a neurochemical dysfunction, and the treatments for it are mostly medication. It's most typically characterized by an excessive degree of self-referential material. Ideas of reference, delusions, hallucinations, living in a world that is unique to that individual and that no one else can really share in. So you see an intense involvement. I see an intense involvement very often in the families of schizophrenics, often in the mother, who is often the primary caregiver, trying to get through to this very disturbed and increasingly isolated individual, their child. And it's pretty heartbreaking because a lot of them just don't get it. In much the same way that, the thinking that I'm acquainted with no longer sees autism spectrum disorders as a result of bad parenting, but again, as something that is baked into that person's brain.
Thanks, George. Courtney.
You're welcome.
I don't want to get too off topic in terms of like just conceptualizing schizophrenia as a diagnosis. I think I just find myself having a reaction to the Western conceptualization of schizophrenia as something that can mostly be treated as something, with medication and other things, especially considering the significant research that's been done about how folks with schizophrenia have significantly worse outcomes in Western cultures and in cultures that try and treat it with medication exclusively, as opposed to contextualizing the person, the individual, giving them a job that they can do functionally that makes sense for them, and connecting with resources and connecting with community in a way that's very much not the way we do things here, right? We pathologize them as someone who can't work, who has to be hospitalized and medicated in these ways. And there's so much research that finds that is actually the opposite of what is supportive for folks with schizophrenia. Not to say anything against medication or anything like that. I just think it's really important, if this is what we're looking at and this is what we're talking about, to really look critically at how we conceptualize schizophrenia and what research actually shows is supportive for these folks.
Yeah. And you're speaking to, I think, what you're talking about, Courtney, contextualizing Bowen of coming after this very big psychodynamic wave of conceptualizing individuals intrapersonally and saying, wait a minute, we're social beings. These systems occur naturally. What if we looked at the diagnoses or the pathologies that we identify in individuals in a different way? So a departure from I agree with you, largely still dominant conceptualization of diagnoses as being intrapersonal.
Thank you for putting that so much more succinctly than I just did.
That was great. This is great. I'm getting a sense of this desire for this conversation. So thank you so much, everybody, for participating. Marcy, and I think Laura, I saw a hand come up.
I remember reading a study, it was about 10 years ago, and I I'll try to find it. It was an Israeli study of previously hospitalized schizophrenic patients and how their symptoms either escalated or de-escalated based on the level of emotional expressivity in their families.
Mhm.
I'm not sure how you would apply this in a Bowenian sense, but clearly there is some overlap between the the neurological aspects of the disorder and what is contributing to it or ameliorating it
Hmm.
on the family and the way that they're functioning.
Yeah. Thank you, Marcy. Laura, did I see a hand? Or did you? put it down?
I was just thinking about it, that when Kearney was saying the component of culture and language being missed, I remember one of my patients being diagnosed with some form of a schizoaffective disorder and was going to be put on Zyprexa and things like that. And when I spoke with her, she was talking about talking to the people that were no longer there, like her father and her mother, and that she would see them. But then when I actually did a little bit more in depth, it was her belief. It was more a spiritual belief on seeing and hearing things versus the schizoaffective. So I literally had to contact the psychiatrist and say, it's not what you think it is. You know, this is what she's talking about. So sometimes I feel like when Kearney was talking about that, reminded me that sometimes that cultural and language piece is missed in diagnosis of the schizophrenia or schizophrenia or the schizoaffective disorders.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Laura. Absolutely. And again, I will once again say the DSM is very culturally bound. The way that we conceptualize our diagnoses sometimes really doesn't capture exactly what you're talking about right now, Laura. So thank you so much for that. Okay, so please continue to raise your hands. This is great. It pops you right up to the top. I can see it. I can call on you and all that fun stuff. So, beautiful segue into the next slide about really this, the natural family systems approach largely being not necessarily an answer, but another perspective from the dominant psychoanalytic approach. So really seeing people in context and looking at the ways in which man is very similar to, or humans are very similar to other living creatures, whereas in the psychoanalytic approach, humans are thought to be very unique. The one thing that does differentiate us is our feeling system. We'll talk about that in terms of the emotional family system. And then other quotes, just a second, I'm gonna check okay. Sorry, I just want to make sure that I didn't miss a question or something in the chat. So go ahead.
So I know when I read the first chapters of the Bowen book, it really emphasized this idea of us not being as far from what they called like lower animals.
Yeah.
So in a way, it almost sounded like Bowen's history or framework came from kind of a evolutionary biology point of view. And I was just wondering if that was correct in understanding his view into that.
Yes, he took a lot of his approaches from Darwin.
Okay.
Which is seated very strongly in evolution. Yeah, so a very biological evolutionary education that informed natural family systems. All right. Sorry, I keep losing what I did with this. So I'll just keep seeing my screensaver. Okay, so again, many of these things will just be reiterated from the reading. So please, if you have a question about clarity or anything that you want some further discussion on, please feel free to pause me and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But again, the Bowen saw many of the things that happen within the family system, the nuclear family system, that family of origin, happening throughout nature, and to the point where these are these instinctual behaviors, things like reproduction, that it's almost beyond our consciousness, that brings us together. So one of the things that I really want to differentiate, and we'll get to that in a few slides, is the difference between the emotional system and then the feeling system and intellectual system that inform the emotional system or play a part in the emotional system, because there is a clear differentiation in this approach between emotional and feeling, and we will get to that. So this emotional is, it's this beyond, almost beyond consciousness, beyond awareness pull that we have, this rhythm, this syncedness, if that's a word, that we have with our fellow human beings and those who we have intimate, close relationships with. So it's something beyond our awareness, but that is informed by feeling and intellectual. So when you hear emotional system, we're not thinking about like happy, sad, mad, those types of feelings. It's a more undercurrent connection that we have to one another. So what natural family systems, somebody have something to say? Okay. What natural family systems provides us is a method of organizing and categorizing events that happen within the family system, within an individual connected to a system. Again, it's a theory, so therefore it's a way of helping us predict future events, ways of explaining past events, particularly looking very heavily at transgenerational influences, and then giving us an understanding of what I would argue contributes to events and gives us the potential to control these events. Because if, again, with that emotional system being driven by both a feeling system and a thinking system or an intellectual system, when we become very heavily influenced by the feeling system, reactions and responses can become quite automatic and feel as though they're out of our control. So one of the big, as we know, goals of natural family systems is differentiation of self. And that is inviting more of the intellectual system to drive our behaviors and to drive our decisions, because it makes it more conscious and gives us more agency. So that's one of the main goals of this, is to feel as though we have more control over these dynamics and these patterns that feel very automatic and very ingrained within our family and within ourselves. So, and the idea of extended family is not only people that are currently living. So again, the transgenerational transmission process, this transgenerational look at families include every person that has ever had an influence on where we are today. And as we know with the genogram, we tend to go back 3 generations, or we have 3 generations. So we're really going back 2 generations, because our generation, like if we were to be the client, is part of that. But understanding and including individuals who are still living, those who have died, those who are both absent or present in session, and those who are not there. So even if we don't get a chance as clinicians, for example, to interact directly with individuals, we're still, quote, inviting them into the room to be a part of the conversation, to understand all of these dynamics in context. And these emotional systems are transgenerational, again, regardless of who is in the room. One of the things that we read, for example, in the book is that a current, let's say, marital conflict or an impending divorce may be happening due to an unfinished divorce several generations ago. So that's how included past generations and past family members are into the room and into the conceptualization of what might be contributing to the symptomology that is being seen within the family. We alluded to this a little bit earlier of the pseudo, when we're talking about schizophrenia, the pseudo self or the pretend self versus the solid self or real self. So the pseudo self is almost like a declaration of independence, but still highly emotionally fused to and influenced by others. So the difference between a pseudo self or a pretend self and a solid self or true self, real self, is that the solid self is able to have beliefs, morals, convictions that hold regardless of other people's reactions to them. So I hold true in this belief, and I am not going to be swayed due to other people's reactions to this. So it's not based in a rigidity, which is a little bit different. So like we've talked, or like we saw in the video of this response to anxiety of really trying to control others, it's a differentiation of I can still feel connected to those around me while having my own thoughts, beliefs, and convictions. Whereas the pseudo self is highly influenced by those around them. So maybe in one setting, they declare some kind of belief or moral, and then with another set of people, they may declare something different. So it really is a changing of who that person is based on the reactions to anything that they may say or do. So pseudo self,
Sarah?
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the pseudo self and how that relates to being an emotional cutoff?
Sure. So emotional cutoff happens when emotional fusion has been there for a long time. So an emotional cutoff is an attempt to create distance when there has been no distance for too long of a time and it's no longer tolerable. So the pseudo self is essentially like a breaking off as opposed to what we would consider like a growing apart. So a breaking apart versus growing apart. So remember, an emotional cutoff doesn't mean that you're not emotionally connected. It means that you're trying to convince yourself that I am no longer emotionally influenced by or emotionally connected to somebody. So emotional cutoff is not a like a result of differentiation. It is a result of, or an outcome. I guess that's kind of synonymous with, I'm trying to make it not causal. That's what I'm trying to do, is to say that there's many factors that play into this. But essentially it is an attempt to distance yourself, whether it is geographically or emotionally, because they can live a little bit apart from one another, geographic cutoffs and emotional cutoffs, but it still is informed by a very intense emotional connection to that person. So the pseudo self is being formed because they're still affected by this person. Does that help you? Does that make sense, Sarah?
Yeah, so like for instance, in a family, it would be like mother and dad have a really difficult relationship. So daughter moves away and only comes to see him once in a while. And when they are together, she's pseudo self, meaning she doesn't hold true to her morals or her values when she's around him and just lets it lie because that's easier for the emotional system.
Sure. So that would be
on the right
what's
track?
considered, yeah. So that would be considered a more mild emotional cutoff because there's still interaction, but the interaction is very surface. So like true differentiation is the ability to have no more honest, maybe some difficult conversations, vulnerable conversations, while having an appreciation for differences and still staying true to what you believe and who you are.
Okay.
So there's degrees of cutoff as well. So okay. your example would be like a moderate at most, but it sounds more mild.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. Caitlin.
I guess just on that point, it sounds to me what I'm getting from that almost in response to the solid self is like, you were like, it's not based in rigidity, where I feel like the pseudo or emotional cutoff is almost based in a level of rigidity where it's like all or nothing, very black and white, like we're either like super fused or I'm and it's also related to like a lower level of differentiation because you can't differentiate the same. So solid self isn't based in rigidity and maybe shows a higher level of differentiation where maybe the pseudo self is more or less specifically relating to cutoff is based in rigidity and
Yes.
a lower level of differentiation.
Yeah, and it usually comes after a time of prolonged fusion.
Okay.
I can't be myself, and I still don't really know how to be myself, but I'm going to be myself over here.
Right.
So the emotional connection doesn't change. The attempt to diffuse the anxiety is different.
Got it.
Great questions, everyone. Anything else? All right, I'm going to find this. Oh my goodness. Okay. So what happens, so again, looking transgenerationally, right? So understanding the influence that your family of origin has on, so family of origin is the family you grew up in. Nuclear family is like your family of creation, essentially. So when two individuals create pseudo selves or have pseudo selves, they can find one another. So in a marriage, in a romantic relationship, and can become fused. And then what can happen is pseudo selves don't necessarily happen as a result of a cutoff. A cutoff can inform a pseudo self, but a pseudo self doesn't have to come as a result of a cutoff. But if individuals from the respective families of origins have essentially created a pseudo self and not a solid self, they can fuse with one another, and then a result of an emotional cutoff from their family of origin. So this may be where you see themes in a genogram of the people within the spousal unit, I guess, or the romantic unit, having distant relationships with their families of origins. And that's essentially to balance out the fusion that they have with one another. So we'll talk about this a little bit. I don't want to get too much ahead of myself with this, but any triangle ultimately wants to be equilateral. So if you have fusion between two people, you are likely going to have a third person in a distant position. So you may have like a healthy boundary or a healthy relationship on one side, but fusion is nearly always going to be balanced out by distance in another relationship. So you'll see that when you do a genogram, you'll see some of these patterns come out whenever you get from a client a sense of distance in one relationship, I would encourage you to ask about closeness in a relationship with another person. Justine.
Okay, so when we discussed triangles, one question I did have was, I know in previous theories like structural and strategic, there was a lot of emphasis put on the couple as like in the top of the hierarchy. So I was wondering, within triangles in this theory, say you have a mom, dad, and a child, would the relationship be different since they're all looking to be equilateral? Therefore, would the triangle then be different structurally, because then it would be equal on all corners? Does that make sense?
So if I'm understanding you right, is a question that you're asking, like, do hierarchies play a role in triangle?
In the triangle.
I would say in this theory, no.
Okay.
Because the definition of a healthy relationship may differ from, like, let's say parent to child versus, romantic partner to romantic partner. And remember, I also want to, while we're on the topic of triangles, because there's just a lot of stuff going on with this theory, is that just because 3 people are in a triangle does not mean that a third person is triangulated. So you can remain emotionally detached, but once that system has been, so it's like kind of once those pathways have been created, once a person has been pulled in to a dyadic conflict or something like that, that doesn't mean that that person is permanently triangulated into that. So I don't want you to look at triangles as inherently bad things either. So triangles are the smallest stable unit within a family system, because two individuals have, it can be stable when it's calm, but it doesn't stay calm. And the kind of natural process is to, what we've learned before from strategic or from structural, for example, is detouring, but it's essentially triangulating a third person in to have an emotional reaction to what is going on. So that third person is pulled in to take a side. So once that triangle is established, it's there, but that doesn't mean that that third person is consistently taking a side. So once that triangle is established, that third person can also do things like, sounds like a conversation you need to have with this other person. So that is neutrality. That is what one of the goals of natural family systems is recognizing that this emotional system exists and that you don't have to play feelings all the time, that you can have more of an intellectual response to that while you're deferring the tension that's coming to you, the attention that's coming to you, and say, looks like you two need to have a person-to-person conversation and leave me out of it. That's ultimately the goal.
Which is exactly what a Bowenian therapist should be doing, right? You're gonna be brought into the triangle, but you want to resist to be triangulated. So you go, you bring it to you and you put it back on them.
Yes.
And not have an emotional attachment reaction to what's happening.
So what we do, so as a therapist, we are absolutely going to be triangled because we are a third person that has entered into this system. What is different about our position from a Bowenian standpoint is that we maintain emotional neutrality. We do not become activated. So it is okay. That's where we're kind of moving and diverting a lot of conversation. For example, like when one of the, let's say we're with a couple or something, and one partner says, see, Sarah, see what this person, or like, she always does this, or he always does this, they always do this. Your job in that moment would be say that to that person. Like, you are not a go-between. In Bowenian, you're very much like EFT and other approaches, you're consistently turning the family members toward one another and saying, have these person-to-person conversations. I am not a person to go through and use pronouns of people, say you, talk from an I position. So yes, triangles are not inherently bad. When you see them, it's not a bad thing. It's in times of extreme anxiety or tension that that person is pulled in from an emotional place, and that's not sustainable. But they happen all the time for short periods of time. Like, how many times have any of you had a fight with a significant other and called a parent or called a friend? You just triangulated them, or you just attempted to triangulate them. That it's a natural, again, human response to anxiety. The problem is when you have a sustained issue with your significant other, for example, and the only way that you're coping with it is by talking to an outsider. I see some faces, maybe some people who really resonate.
I know it didn't mention this specifically within this theory, but I know in strategic, it said that the third person doesn't have to be a person, but within this theory, it has to be a person.
Nope, it can be an entity. It can be a substance. It can be work. It can be church. It can be, a community of other, it does not have to be an animate. Are humans animate objects? I just assume that's the opposite of an inanimate object. Anyway, it doesn't have to be a living being, but it could be like a dog too. Like, it could be an animal. So yes, it does not have to be a person. It's any attempt to distance yourself emotionally from anxiety, from conflict, from tension. And that usually involves a third something. Yes, exactly, Sarah. It can be AA, substance use, absolutely. So it is the lack of a person-to-person at least conversation or attention, acknowledgement of what's going on. It doesn't have to be resolution, but anytime that you don't go directly to the source of the conflict, you are likely triangulating something else. Okay, on that note, let's go ahead and take our first break, and we will come back together at 3:10. Great conversation, guys. This is awesome. All right, everyone, let's plug through for the next 50 minutes. And then I really want to take the last hour of class to apply the case study that I sent you. So whatever we get through in the next 50 minutes is what we get through. All right, so okay, so the 4 foundational concepts, we've touched on each one of these, but I wanted to introduce these first, knowing that the 8 interlocking concepts of differentiation of self and everything, they're all informed by these 4 foundational concepts. So we've already talked about anxiety. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but what Bowen does is differentiate, sorry, I'll make this bigger, differentiate between acute anxiety and chronic anxiety. So in this theory, acute anxiety is a very real threat, something that's like happening right now. Chronic anxiety may be informed by like a worry, or it may not be a like active threat. It is almost a learned behavior of anxiety. So the difference between acute and chronic is one is, and he doesn't say that one is valid or not. He's talking about it being like active, real, happening right now. So acute, active, real, happening right now. Chronic, not necessarily happening right now, kind of almost a residual response to an acute anxiety. Then Justine brought this up earlier, the 2 basic life forces, the desire for individuality and the simultaneous desire for togetherness. Again, this is not just differentiation. This informs all 8 of the other concepts that we'll be talking about. Go ahead, Sarah.
Just real quickly back to the anxiety, because I was reading that one of the goals is to reduce chronic anxiety.
Correct.
Would you say, oh, it is, okay, so it'd be to reduce the chronic anxiety, not necessarily focus on the acute?
Right, so the acute is like inevitable, it happens, but chronic is it's not necessarily reacting to an active threat. It is staying emotionally aroused when a threat is no longer there, or the response of anxiety is no longer like, I don't want to say needed, but you're physiologically also aroused when there's no real stimulus for it. There's no organic stimulus for it.
Right. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's more of an emotional response. I mean, anxiety is emotional, but it's more of a residual staying emotional response to something that has happened and passed, and it's really no longer kind of like applicable, but it's staying.
like even something that happened generations and generations ago.
Exactly, right. So it could be like a chronic anxiety, for example. Like I'll even use an example from like my own family. So generations ago, we had like some land stolen from us. Essentially like my great grandparents were, I guess, kind of duped, taken advantage of. And so like it has stayed in our family of this fear of being taken advantage of, even though there's no real reason. It's just kind of this legacy that has been passed down through generations. So that would be an example of like a chronic anxiety that there's no real reason for it. It's just been, we've inherited it.
That's why I feel like this theory works so well within substance abuse families that, you know, have generations and generations of substance abuse. I feel like this just relates so well.
Good, great. So then we've also alluded to the emotional system. Again, this is this like instinctual reflex-like connection, influence that we have on one another that is informed by both the feeling system, which is the felt emotion. So it's when we can put words, it's the conscious feeling of that undercurrent emotional system. So the emotional system, you can't really identify a feeling with it, but the feeling system is the conscious felt like connection. And then the intellectual system is the thinking piece, the more like, I guess you could quote, rational piece of this emotional system. And then the understanding that the family is an emotional unit. So mutual influence on one another. When one piece moves, other pieces adjust. Also, we don't like being changed. So we're gonna want to keep the homeostasis. Justine.
Okay, so I had a question concerning the thinking and the feeling, because I know in the reading, it said several times, like one who is differentiated is able to distinguish between thinking and feeling.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't necessarily agree with that, because while talking about something like anxiety, it is a thinking thing. And so I'm wondering how Bowen would kind of distinguish between the two, because like rumination would still be an intellectual thing, but is not a feelings thing. And by reading that over and over again, you kind of feel like, okay, so the less differentiated someone is, the more they yearn for togetherness and like emotion of being validated. But if you're thinking, that doesn't happen, which I don't necessarily agree with.
So I'm trying to find where, because I think I have it in the notes in one of these slides, if anybody else is looking at the PowerPoint. But to what you're saying, Justine, you can have essentially a subjective intellectual experience that may be driven by feeling. So that's how the kind of the inverse of what you're talking about can happen. So the intellectual, so he doesn't like value one over the other. He says they naturally occur. This is what's happening. In order to kind of get unstuck from some of these seemingly very automatic responses, we have to take a second to slow down and become more aware of our contribution. And that's really the backbone of the intellectual system, is being truly a systemic thinker and saying, what am I doing? Or how am I contributing to what is going on? Therefore, I can have some agency to do something different and become less emotionally reactive to what is going on around me. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, Justine.
Oh, you are.
Okay.
I think for me, I misread it, or I understood it incorrectly, because I kept thinking like, oh, okay, so like more differentiated, more thinking, less differentiated, more feeling. But you clarified by saying like you can have an intellectual response by being driven by emotion.
Correct. And they're not, again, we're not looking for these like fully emotionally detached, like, experiences where we're not affected by anything. It's the recognition that you're going to be affected. Now take a step back and say, am I reacting out of like true emotion without really thinking? Am I being influenced by others? Can I distinguish between these two things? That's really the crux of differentiation of self, because it happens on two levels: intrapersonally, so the ability to differentiate or distinguish, I guess, between thinking and feeling, and then interpersonally, of being simultaneously connected to and individual from or autonomous from those. So you're not just constantly pulled in directions or making decisions based on acceptance or wanting to be liked or wanting to not disappoint somebody. So your actions aren't dictated by what your anticipated or perceived reaction from someone else would be. Doesn't mean that you're not affected by it. It means that you're more aware that this is happening. So then you can slow it down and like act accordingly to that. That's true to you.
Would that also mean that if someone, depending, okay, wait, how do I phrase this? Would that mean then that the differentiation of the person would only really be known to that person because, like two people could do the same behavior, but depending on what their intention is behind it, it could either mean that they are trying to react off of someone or really just being true to themselves?
I think you could argue that that is an individual process, but I wouldn't take away the family from that either, or the system, I guess, from potential, like from noticing that. So there would have to be, when somebody is working towards self-differentiation, there's going to be pushback. Systems do not like change. We want equilibrium, we want homeostasis. We like the rules and regulations that we've established. And when people do things different, we want to rein them in. So there would have to be a consistency with this. That's one of the reasons why Bowenian isn't really a short term, isn't considered one of the shorter term approaches, because it's really like this long-term process. You don't necessarily need to be in therapy for the entire thing, but your differences are going to be noticed by family members, and you have to stay consistent with that. So is it an internal process in a way? Of course, because there's an intrapersonal piece to self-differentiation, but there's also the interpersonal piece of, I need to stay consistent to this in order to change dynamics in the relationships. So it's like a both and response to your question, Justine. Any other questions, comments? Okay. So these two life forces. So we've established some of this where, we have this simultaneous pull. So again, this natural pull toward being individual, autonomous, and also being connected. So when you go too far on either way, you are cut off or isolated, or you are fused or very, very much influenced by others. So staying with the systemic view, one of the things that Bowen always stayed away from when he was talking with families, working with families, and when he was coaching families, is to stay away from the question why. We tend to teach that just because it can feel very like attacking or kind of aggressive. But once you ask a person, why do you do this? You are taking away, you've stepped outside of the systemic way of thinking. You've gone fully intrapersonal, and you're going to go cause and effect. You're going to think very linearly. So that question was really taken off the table with this approach. And I would encourage y'all to use why as little or not at all. So the balance between individuality and togetherness is also balanced by energy that individuals put into a relationship. So that underlined piece of bullet number 2 of when 2 individuals put in the same amount of life energy, however that's quantified, that's how relationships grow and evolve. And so when there's unequal effort or energy that is put into a relationship, that relationship won't be sustained. So the thought behind that, the premise behind that is that there is life energy, there is effort that is being put into these relationships, so they are inevitably affected by one another. And Justine, maybe to what you were talking about earlier, the capacity for autonomous functioning does not mean a person lacks emotions or feelings. It means that while the person may respond to input from others on an emotional, feeling, and subjective level, they also have the capacity to process these responses on an objective level. So it is that balance of recognizing I'm going to be affected by this, but let's take a step back from the automatic response to this feeling and like bring in some objective thought into this. So to the last piece is being able to process on this higher level, the valued level, the intellectual level, because again, it's not better or worse. It's just the ability to integrate both. This allows the person to not have automatic responses and permit some level of choice. So again, we see this even in highly emotionally focused approaches like EFT. It's this taking a step back, slowing down and saying, how am I contributing to this? So this is not void of emotion. It's the integration of that thought and that slowing down to integrate the choice. I'm just trying to see if there's anything we can. So essentially here,
just to clarify, you would define objectivity as coming from the standpoint of how I am contributing to this.
Yes. Okay, so this is just talking about, early stages of relationships. They tend to be pretty calm and relaxed, and then all the emotional stuff comes in, and all that reactivity comes in. So relationships can deteriorate quite quickly. So just something to keep in mind of even at the beginning when things tend to be pretty calm. Oops, sorry. They can deteriorate and based on or influenced by these individuals coming together, their level of differentiation. So the level of deterioration is an indicator of their level of differentiation. So some symptoms of anxiety can manifest in things like overeating, undereating, overachieving, underachieving, substance use, affairs. So these are just some things when, if this is a presenting issue, a potential thing to assess for is level of anxiety, if this is an approach that makes sense to you and you want to incorporate into your work. All right, I'm just trying to be aware of time and get to all of this stuff. So we talked about this acute versus chronic. So acute, this is real and short-lived. Chronic lingers, even though the threat has passed. So it's essentially a way of responding to threats. And this anxiety is transmitted in several ways. So among members of the same system, we saw this in the video, that it can kind of get absorbed. And as we know, the projection process is not like given equally, for example, with a family with children, to each individual sibling. So you may have one sibling that is less differentiated due to having absorbed some maybe a disproportionate amount of the family's anxiety. So members in the same system within the family, other members of the system among members of the system can be with multiple people, the other members of the system can be within 2 people, and then one generation to another, as we know, that transgenerational transmission process. So with chronic anxiety, so within this approach, just so you know, emotional reactivity and anxiety are used interchangeably. And then when people get anxious, one of the ways that they can deal with it, cope with it, is to become more intent on getting people to do things their way. So it increases rigidity. So with less differentiation, in times of higher anxiety, and in times of chronic high anxiety, the rigidity is what creates such a reaction to the tension. There's not flexibility in how to cope with that. So less differentiation, more rigidity. So the differentiation and anxiety is an inverse relationship. With the lower differentiation, higher anxiety, higher reactivity to anxiety, and then with higher differentiation, lower reactivity to anxiety or ability to like cope with anxiety. So some things that you could use when you may have a family or family member who has chronic anxiety, some more mindfulness, some mind-body connection, some more holistic approaches of things like biofeedback, transcendental meditation, yoga, jogging, other stress management activities that usually require some movement of the body. So now moving to these 8 interlocking concepts. We touched on them all in the video. We've actually pretty much talked about all of them. Go ahead, Sarah.
Just real quickly, I know in the last slide you were talking about things to reduce chronic anxiety, but we actually have to work on improving one's differentiation of self. What are you going to be getting to some of the like interventions? Okay.
Yep. The last few slides, and I can privilege some of those so I can skip through a few of the things, because really the concepts we've covered, but I'll show you some techniques, because it really is. So as opposed to pretty much all of the approaches that we've talked about thus far, Bowenian and natural family systems is really big on insight. So that's one of the, actually raising insight is one of the interventions or the approaches to, I guess it's not really an intervention, it's a goal in order to improve differentiation, to increase self-differentiation. So as we talked about differentiation of self, both interpersonal, intrapersonal, we've talked about the family emotional system and how it is mutually affecting one another, the family projection process. So this is when there is anxiety either from a, past generation. Well, no, cut that with we'll go like parents, child. So with the projection process, it's around anxiety. So projecting anxiety onto children. And the main thing to remember with this is that it can happen unevenly with children. So one child may be projected upon more so than others, which generally influences lower differentiation because they're absorbing more of that emotional distress, the emotional reactivity within the family. In the multi-generational transmission process, we've talked about how, a current divorce that's happening may be finishing an unfinished divorce several generations ago. It's the legacy of anxiety and how that's transmitted from generation to generation when there's no attempt to differentiate, when there is no attempt to defuse, when there is no attempt to bridge a cutoff. So this is where the theory is, without intervention, the level of differentiation between generations will become less and less. And you can also see on some genograms how for example, this family projection process being having siblings be affected at different rates, that you may have like a branch of the genogram or a branch of the family tree that is more differentiated because maybe they were a sibling that didn't really absorb, or they weren't the like recipient of the anxiety. So I hope that makes sense of like, if you have two parents, for example, 3 children, you may have this child, like, because theoretically with sibling position, the oldest and youngest child are like most at risk for being triangulated and absorbing some of that emotional reactivity. You may see less differentiation in their trees of the genogram and more differentiation in the like middle child, for example. So with triangles, as we've established, triangles are the smallest stable unit, but that unit is also limited. So when the tension, when the anxiety within that triangle becomes unsustainable, intolerable, other people will be brought in. So the one triangle, I mean, we saw it in the video, but the one triangle here can extend into interlocking triangles. So you could even imagine these as overlapping, where an issue that originally had 3 people now has 5 people in it. And it's all in an effort to diffuse the anxiety, to like share the anxiety. Then we've talked a little bit about sibling position and how this doesn't necessarily mean chronological sibling position. So, you know, we have firstborn, secondborn, thirdborn, that kind of stuff, but sibling position can also be in functionality. So you may have like a thirdborn where the first and secondborn are boys, for example, and you have a thirdborn that is a girl. She could function as a firstborn by virtue of being the firstborn of her gender, and vice versa, girl, girl, boy, or something like that. It could be functionality in terms of maybe like an oldest child that may have a disability could functionally be a youngest child, or vice versa, where that person has a lot of maybe power within the system. And then emotional cutoff is the attempt, again, to diffuse, to create distance. When the fusion and the emotional intensity becomes too much, I haven't exactly made an attempt to let you know my vulnerability, my emotional state. So I'm just going to either, it can be a both and, because a geographical cutoff doesn't necessarily mean they're emotionally cut off. And an emotional cutoff doesn't necessitate a geographical cutoff. So remember, the emotional piece, regardless of where you are, is, am I still affected by this person? Do I still make decisions or act with this person in mind? That is considered fusion. And even though I have claimed that I no longer care about this person, that they don't affect me, that declaration would be evidence to the contrary. So are you still acting based on or informed by another individual? Or have you been a recipient of the projection process and you've been triangulated, and now I've been in this position for too long, I have to do something completely different, and I'm still going to be emotionally affected, but I'm going to change the intimacy in terms of like, what's the level of vulnerability that I'm going to bring into my conversations? Am I going to just talk to my dad about the weather because that's safe, and I know that I can maintain calm? Because if we go anywhere deeper than that, it's going to turn into a fight. It's going to turn into a conflict. And then Caitlin, you were talking about this earlier, of the emotional process within society. One thing that Bowen brought in was that macro influence on the society of when there is times of heightened anxiety, for example, in a global pandemic, you may see some more anxiety within the family. It's essentially mirrored within that family system. So bringing the view out and seeing the societal influences on the family. Okay. Now,
but that also, I know we had talked about it in other our theories class, but because he addresses that, would that also indicate that this theory addresses third order change?
Say more, Justine.
Well, I know first order, like we've talked about first order change and second order change, but then third order change would be the interaction between the society and the familial system that affect one another and how that is changed. So then wouldn't this theory address third order change?
So would third order change include extended family members?
Yeah, I think it's more of a system. So third order change refers to a process in which schemata themselves become objects for continuous cognitive innovation and development. So like almost like the consciousness of the projected familial system projecting back onto the societal consciousness and back and forth to create a change in dynamic of how we exist within society.
Yeah, I mean, I would guess, so I can look into this more, Justine, but based on when this theory was created and like when the awareness of third order change, like, or when it like more so entered the vernacular, I wouldn't guess that was really part of the this approach. Like, I don't think that a goal of this would be third order change.
Okay.
But again, with integration with these, waves of innovation within our field, that absolutely could be something very easily incorporated into this when working with families. Okay, so I'm skipping around a little bit here, but Sarah, with one of your kind of questions of intervention. So again, like techniques within this approach were de-emphasized. There weren't these, kind of like cookie cutter techniques to use. They exist within it, but it really is about differentiation, bridging cutoffs, increasing awareness, increasing insight. So remember, when an emotional cutoff happens, it is an attempt to diffuse anxiety, is an attempt to diffuse and distance from basically too much closeness. It is also not sustainable, and these cutoffs have a ripple effect through generations. So again, that's where the real importance when you're conceptualizing cases through a Bowenian viewpoint is to sincerely take into consideration all of these 8 interlocking concepts. So you can't, to truly look at systems through a natural family systems lens, you really have to be incorporating all 8. You can't kind of pick and choose because they don't make sense and they don't work without one another. So I just really want to emphasize that if you're like, you know what, I really don't like this thing, in order to understand another concept that you might resonate with, it's not made to work in isolation. So for what it's worth. So bridging cutoff. So again, in the effort of differentiation, it's both intrapersonally and interpersonally is, so I'm confident that you all can think of maybe exceptions to doing this. So when I've taught this before, I've had some, students say, wait a minute, like what if you've had a, abusive relationship with a parent, is it safe? Would this be something that Bowen would encourage to make that person to person contact with them if like an emotional cutoff feels just or seems just? That is on a family to family basis. So yes, because I'm even thinking of like, individuals within the LGBTQ community who come out to their family and their family says, you are no longer a part of this family. And so, because remember, a cutoff is mutual. In order for an emotional cutoff to occur, 2 people have to be participating in that. A cutoff can't happen if one person is consistently trying to connect. So it's sustained by 2 people. So, that individual who was, kicked out of their, disowned by their family, would this be an appropriate approach to take in encouraging that individual to go back into a system that created trauma within that person? that would need more conversation about what that person wants. So it's not this blanket, always go and create these person-to-person relationships, go back to the people who have hurt you in some very significant ways. And this is also bridging cutoff only happens once a level of self-differentiation that is kind of mutually decided by both the therapist and the client is at a high enough level that making these attempts to bridge cutoffs won't be devastating to the person because they're still emotionally very affected by those around them. Does all of this make sense? Does anybody have any questions about anything I just said? Okay, so this should be detriangulating, I'm sorry, self and emotional situations. So so bridging cutoff generally is going to the person that you may have had conflict with. I'm even thinking of people within families that have been fighting for so long. If you ask them what are you fighting about, they don't even know anymore. This may be a candidate for this person-to-person relationship. And then intrapersonally becoming a better observer of your own emotional reactiveness. So taking some time, how am I feeling? How is what I'm feeling maybe really informing or potentially dictating how I am behaving? And then whenever there is an attempt to triangulate you, that you take a distant or emotionally neutral stance and say, you two got this. I'm not going to be a part of this. Okay, so then
Wait, I have a question in terms of the example of the LGBT community.
Sure.
Say there is a system where they don't necessarily, they're not LGBTQ friendly or they're not an ally.
Sure.
How do you increase differentiation that is based on a belief that, for example, being gay is wrong? And on top of that, I think within the text, it had also said, if the anxiety is too high, then homosexual behavior will become a symptom. And I'm
yeah,
that's yeah. So I'm just confused as to because I understand on a generalized level how basically you can bridge cutoff, but how do you bridge cutoff when it's not based on an emotion, but a belief that this is wrong. I will not accept you as my son if you are gay.
Sure. Well, the beliefs are driven by emotions, right? So, and it would be the emotional reactivity to the belief. So theoretically within this example, it could be lessening the emotional reactivity to the belief and making a decision of if you want to continue this relationship, knowing that there's this kind of barrier that's there, where maybe there isn't an acceptance for who that person is, but there truly is a desire to maintain some kind of relationship with this person, that there would have to be an acceptance of that and the lessening of the emotional reactivity that comes from that interaction. And not changing who you are to make another person comfortable or to, appease or to, avoid conflict or something like that. Does that answer your question, Christine?
Yeah, it's just difficult to conceptualize that in practice. Because
that's where the conversation with the individual would come in. So, questions about if you were to attempt this, what would be the worst case scenario? And let's talk that through. Let's talk about the pros and cons of bridging this cutoff. Let's talk about
where I get stuck is just let's take the process or the experience of racism. Okay, so you're not supposed to budge and change your opinion, but then you're supposed to have these conversations where it's okay, I accept you for being racist without reactivity, but I'm still not okay with your belief. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would be a conversation around the navigating of those differences.
Okay.
So if the hope or the desire is to have a relationship, knowing that these things exist, it could also be where there is an attempt to better understand some of the like systemic influences of that belief. Because again, you're not asking why, because then that takes away the system. It would be a process in that. All right. So again, skipping around just a little bit here. So if you're interested, I did, so again, because we won't have time to cover all of this, but I did, there is a video that's embedded in this, and if it doesn't work, it's down here in the note, about just triangles, if you want a more, just another explanation of it and some pictorial representation of it as well. So again, the formation of interconnected relationships or interconnected interlocking triangles is this attempt to shift the emotion, or this attempt to not emotionally overheat. So you're diffusing it by adding more and more people into the situation. Okay, so I'm gonna go, so there, with family evaluation, these are some questions that you can ask when you are assessing the family. But I want to go to the stance of the therapist and some of the techniques. So as a like Bowenian practicing therapist, what you would do is sit more in the seat of a consultant, teacher, or coach. So you're essentially on the sidelines emotionally within this. And so you are also modeling for the family this intellectual processing. And one of the techniques that you can use for this is encouraging going home. I'll talk about this in just a couple of slides to enhance the insight. So it's going home means, well, let me move to that right now, is where you encourage your clients to establish contact, direct person-to-person contact with their families of origin, individuals within their family of origin. And this again is introduced only once that individual shows some improved self-differentiation. And this person-to-person contact isn't necessarily just individuals within their family of origin. It can be connecting with aunts, uncles, cousins to better understand you in context. So two things that can happen with emotional cutoff is what's considered a primary cutoff, which is it happens. So if let's say the cutoff is between me and my mom, then that is a primary cutoff. Let's say I have a child, and by virtue of my cutoff with my mom, my child has no interaction with my mom or with their grandmother, that would be considered a secondary cutoff. So these happen all the time in families as well, particularly within the generations. So there would be the technique of having that individual connect with those that they have been secondarily cut off from. And this is generally met with resistance, and what would indicate some like a level of differentiation is, so let's say that my child, for example, is encouraged to talk to their grandmother. If the response to that is, I don't want to hurt my mom, that would be an indication of some fusion that's still there. So the goal is for the individual to make the connections that they feel would be helpful for them to understand themselves in context, and also to reduce fusion by essentially growing the net of people who could be part of the interaction, so that the focus isn't so closely on just two people. So we also know the technique of genograms, I think. So a genogram can serve as both an assessment as well as an intervention. So genograms can be really beautiful when you're working with a couple, for example. Couples tend to really appreciate genograms because it gives them another view of their partner and gives them an understanding in a way that maybe they didn't have before. Genograms tend to have at least 3 generations. Sometimes you can have more if you have information on farther back generations. And then it reveals some patterns. That's the main purpose of genograms, is to understand generational patterns that inform the person sitting in front of you. So go ahead, Laura.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask, how would you introduce the genogram to the family? I have done them, but just to keep the names to myself, but not really as they're talking. But how would you use it so they know those patterns that you're talking about?
Yeah, so you have, I'm going to give you maybe a frustrating response, Laura. You always have choices of how to introduce it. If you're asking how Sarah introduces it, I can tell you, I tend to do it from an educational standpoint of, I let them know in that initial session, kind of how I conceptualize families. And I always give a nod to the generational influence of families. And it can be quite intuitive. Sometimes it varies in terms of reception by the family, but I do that once I've attended to their presenting issue. So I'm just thinking of a time where watching Monica McGoldrick work with a family, and the presenting issue was like a teenager that was kind of like acting out, being distant, and she went straight into a genogram, and the family was like, what? Like, we're not here to talk about my parents. I don't understand. So there's this balance of attending to and giving credence to their presenting issue, while then introducing some influences to the presenting issue. So, talking about family influence and asking questions about, so if you're with a parents and a child, for example, asking the parents what their family of origin was like and how it influences their parenting and how they may think it influences their own child. So I introduce it in that way of letting the family know, this is how I conceptualize people. And so this is something that we can do to better understand you in context. And I personally have never had an issue where a family has said, like, I'm uninterested in doing this. Does that answer your question, Laura?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Tiffany, did you raise your hand?
I did. I just, if I could piggyback on what you were saying to Lauren, how would you introduce it?
Sure.
What has been helpful for me is when especially with parents, or either with parents of young children or parents of adult children, and they're looking at the behaviors of either. I've used it as a great tool for both, because oftentimes parents forget that it is a reoccurring behavior, and maybe they've forgotten it, or maybe they've never looked at it from the perspective of their young child or as an adult child, and not being able to see the connection. And so I've used it to where I'll ask the questions of, where has these behaviors, has anyone seen these behaviors before? And if the kid says, oh yeah, I've seen my mom. So then, and the mom is kind of like, stuck or whatever. And then asking the mom, well, what's worked for you? How were you able to manage those behaviors? And then using that as a leveraging point of, okay, if this worked, and then looking at the kid. So now the kid doesn't feel like they're an isolated case, and, oh, I'm not this, outlier from the family. And so they are now able to make a connection better to the family member who has used it in a way of being helpful to themselves or changing that behavior.
Beautiful, Tiffany. Thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. All right. And then the final technique is the eye position. So this is an indication, a behavior that demonstrates at least an attempt at differentiation of self. So you've heard of I statements and the importance of that, where it's really it's not a defendable, it's not a statement that can be really questioned because you're talking about your own experience. Whereas we know that if you start a sentence with you always have the opportunity for somebody to argue with you because you might be wrong. So the I position is this differentiated position of I am affected in this way. And so the example here, it enhances objectivity because the speaker refrains from blaming another person for their reaction. So the example is, I get angry when you, as opposed to you make me angry. So the onus and the perspective is from that person. So these are things as a therapist that you would coach and you would model in the room, and then you would have your clients practice that. So as we know, it's these, micro interactions that inform these larger systemic dynamics, rules, roles. So the I position is a really powerful technique of maintaining individuality and connection within the system of saying, I'm affected in this way. I'm telling my truth, my part, I'm being vulnerable and standing in that, and then coaching the family about being able to kind of hold space for that person and not becoming emotionally reactive to what that person is saying. So those are the three like main techniques that are used within natural family systems. Before we break, questions, comments, reactions. Yeah, Marcy.
As regards the I statements, it is something that, of course, I use or try to, and I have clients who are extremely artful at challenging them, even though I agree with you, it's something that really theoretically can't be challenged, because how do you get into somebody else's internal experience? How do you argue with the feeling? And yet somehow they manage to, in very frustrating ways for me. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or techniques about how to address, a situation like that.
Yeah, I'll pitch it to the class first. I like to hear from all of you. So let's say you have a client who uses an I statement. They share a feeling, and then ultimately they have a family member that's like, you don't feel like that.
Or something like that.
Yeah, that's not really.
It's usually a little more subtle than that.
I get very feet to the fire, like, especially with my couples. Like, I'm thinking of a session I had literally like last week where I asked one partner what it was like for her to hear what her partner said. She just went in, and I was like, you don't get to decide how he feels. Try again. You can tell me how you feel in reaction to what he said, or how you feel hearing that that's how he feels, but you can tell him that's how he feels. I get very feet to the fire to see how they're going to handle me just kind of adding anxiety, but that's definitely not Bowennian.
You're a turn up the temperature one, huh, Courtney?
I don't always do that. I only do that when my couples are being very like, they refuse to see each other. Like I packed go down the middle. Like neither of you want to hear each other right now.
Okay. Thank you, Courtney. George.
Yeah, I've often heard this approach presented as a way to get your partner or another person to hear you better without the blaming. So presented as primarily a communication tactic, but I think the greatest value in it is not in the formula, but in the process that it invites the person to look within themselves and see, how am I really feeling? How is it that I am feeling that way? What do I want? Because knowing this stuff is all anybody can control. People come in and say, well, I used the I statement with my wife and she still didn't do what I wanted.
It's not
and I say, that's really not the point. That's really not the point. So in the way that I try to use it, maybe this is a piece of, what you could call differentiation of self.
I might, thank you, George. So I'm thinking if this is like purely Bowennian, and I don't think any of us are purely anything. So forgive me if this feels incongruent with this, but sticking to the idea of self-differentiation and this ability to basically like believe and hold space for other people's responses that may be disparate from your own. Because that's ultimately what I'm hearing is like, well, I wouldn't feel that way, so therefore it can't be possible that you would feel this way. So that would, you could potentially ask a question like, you know, what is threatening about this emotion? The way that you are feeling right now, have you felt this way before about a response from another person? So again, really trying to bring in the system. So as opposed to why do you feel this way, you know, you're focusing on the individual. I would be curious about other experiences that may bring up a similar reaction in that person, and to talk about that a little bit, because it could be something where there's a projection. It could be, you know, something that's reminiscent of their family of origin, where their partner is a recipient of that and they're not fully aware. So again, it's the goal is raising of insight, understanding the influences of where you've been on where you are now. So that
Sure.
would,
So what do you think is going to happen if you say this? And then where would you get that idea?
right. So, okay. So Courtney said when she's being gentler, she may say something like, what's it like for you to feel like your partner is being dishonest about how they feel? Yeah. Sarah, you asked the question of the person within the system that may be absorbing the anxiety, likely the person that's been triangulated, the person that is the recipient of the projection. Would they be considered the IP? Depends on how their symptomology is manifesting. So, and it also depends on how the family is conceptualizing it, because we don't get many families who come in and say, this is a family issue. We usually get families that come in and say, this person right here causes so much grief for everyone else. So it really depends. I mean, if you're working with insurance, that would be a conversation with the family of like, here's my restrictions on this, or here's my limitations. But so I can't give you a straight answer on that. The likelihood that they're the most like symptomatic or the squeakiest wheel is probably higher. But that doesn't mean that every time is how you could like kind of diagnose the family, if that makes sense. George.
Yeah, I do have a question. Because I really wasn't clear. What do you think Bowen means when he talks about absorbing the anxiety or binding the anxiety? My sense is it's more than just reducing the overall level. How do you think and more maybe even than the person absorbing the anxiety, exhibiting more symptoms?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think he means?
So I see absorbing and binding as two different things. So binding is an attempt to diffuse, right? So you bind by triangulating or putting your attention elsewhere, is my understanding of binding. And then the person that's absorbing is the one that so he talked about this kind of in two ways of being like genetically predisposed in a way to just be the most sensitive, to be the more like the most spongy of the group. But the person that is the most affected, or that like kind of leans in and has their role as the person that diffuses. So Bowen also talked about like, what was it like not the instigator. He had 3 roles that he talked about in the book. Do you guys remember? Like essentially like the diffuser, the instigator, and then the one that like keeps it going. That was this reading, right? Does that ring a bell to anybody? That's okay. It was a lot of reading. So my understanding, George, is that a person that may be just inherently more sensitive to that, and then by virtue of maybe separate or informed by that, that their role in the family becomes the person that kind of sucks up the anxiety and deters from whatever conflict. So it's like they take some, not necessarily ownership in their consciousness about that, but they're the one whose role is to diffuse, which consequently is the absorber of the anxiety, of the tension. So I think of like a family member whose job is to, or like their, unsaid role, like when you have a child who is acting out, that it's when they're sensing tension between the parents, they don't like to see that. So in order for that tension to be diverted someplace else, I'm going to do a thing that I know that my parents can be on the same page about, and that's like disciplining me. So that it's a function of the system, which becomes perpetual. And then that person can become more and more, for lack of a better term, kind of symptomatic when their function is that becomes part of their identity. Does that answer your question, George? In a way.
Kind of, sort of. Thanks.
What's lingering for you?
The notion of anxiety as a thing that's in the air, like carbon monoxide, rather than as something that somebody does. I have difficulty accepting Bowen's definitions of some of these things. So I'm just trying to understand what he means, by some of these things that he says. Because it's certainly not the way I put things.
Would saying emotional reactivity change that as opposed to anxiety? Because
not really.
No, okay. So
not really. So what, the function of absorption. So your illustration, that's helpful. What is this person doing in response to the parental conflict? So the kid's going to act out to reduce the parental conflict, get them on the same page. That makes a kind of sense. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Am I hearing that the difficulty is the thought that anxiety is just omnipresent as opposed to more situational?
I can see that we can have multiple members of the family with high levels of anxiety. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But again, so much in this writing is reasoning by analogy, and sometimes I think it gets very confusing. It's an older use of language that is not in my daily work.
Sure.
And so I'm just trying to have a better understanding of it. Yeah.
Thank you. I can definitely look into that for you, George, because it's a good question. So the absorption and binding.
Now, what does that mean to absorb the anxiety? There's some functionality to it that's nice.
Sure.
And what does that look like? What does that feel like? That I don't know.
Sure. Thank you, Juliana, and then Tiffany, and then we'll take a break so we can get to this case study.
I can speak from a little bit of my own experience. The roles come very clear to my mind, that the parents don't intentionally assign roles to their children.
Right.
However, I understood what my role was without it being communicated to me, which was the fixer. So I absorbed everything that was going on, and I was trying to be as submissive to everyone's desires and wishes to regulate that everyone would feel somewhat okay. And so as the absorber, I ended up having more anxiety. I ended up having, less differentiation. So I was more prone to emotional dysregulation as a result of the absorption. And I hope that this kind of explains the absorption, because I experienced it in that way, even though I geographically removed myself. My emotions were still, like Dr. Lepan was saying, I was not emotionally cut off. So I was always the fixer, even though I was geographically removed.
Sure.
However, that removal eventually helped me to differentiate eventually. So naturally, it was almost as if, in my opinion, Bowen was saying that naturally, we kind of have the answers, but sometimes we don't take those answers and apply them in our life. So we need a little push, and that's where the therapist comes in. I removed myself physically.
Thank you for sharing, Juliana. Tiffany.
For me, from my understanding from the readings and from undergrad, from my grad program, and studying Bowen, the absorption of the anxiety with the clinician or the therapist in the room with the family is being able to ask and literally become the holder, the bearer of the levels of anxiety or what's causing the anxiety. So asking specific questions. How do you feel when this person, and if someone says, well, it makes me nervous or anxious when as soon as the dad comes home and I know that, the house isn't the way it should be. And I know, we all, kind of become anxious because we kind of have an idea of what's going to happen if that. So then the therapist could then transfer that anxiety. So if you were to, you've come home at the same time as dad and the house isn't put together the way that dad likes it to be put, what is it that you would like to see or you feel that could be done better, or what do you think the response could be? So now you are literally getting into the middle of everybody's anxiety of, okay, we know what's going to happen. How do we avoid it? It's kind of like stepping in front of an oncoming train. So if you hear the bells and whistles going off, you would then take a step back, or you would stop and pause before, so that you're not in direct line of the accident. And I think that's, if I'm understanding it correctly, that's the therapist's position, which is absorbing whatever could take place. Now you're creating the alternative and helping, hopefully not to allow that thing to happen.
Right. And
so you're averting.
Yeah. And maintaining that stance of neutrality, right? So as a therapist, if you become emotionally activated, you have successfully been triangulated. So it is this ability to maintain neutrality while allowing people to share their perspective. So in essence, it's allowing the conversations to happen that probably have influenced the anxiety because the conversations haven't been happening. So facilitating that while also not taking sides and seeing like one person's perspective as more valid or anything like that. So it's like the ultimate impartiality. Thank you, Tiffany. Okay, let's go ahead and take a break. We'll come back together at like 4:25. And then, so if you guys can do me a favor, I know it's maybe not like we'll do a working break. So if you haven't had a chance to look at the case study, please give it a look over so you're not spending too much time in your groups, like reading it and understanding it. And please make note of the genogram as well as the like triangulation map that was provided. All right, so let's come back together at 4:25. I'll see you guys in a little bit. Everyone. So wanting to allow some time, we'll continue to play around with timing on this. I know that we had no time 2 weeks ago, so I want to give us some time this week. So going into the 8 interlocking concepts, what did you talk about in your group and how they applied to the case study? Let's start with differentiation of self. I would argue that that's probably one of the goals that y'all came up with for your treatment plan. It's a quite fused couple, quite emotionally reactive to one another. So differentiation of self intrapersonally and interpersonally. What did you apply to this case?
So the male, K, feels very inadequate. He complains that he feels mothered by all the women that have been in his life. He also has an age disadvantage to the woman that he has married. Does feel like because she is the breadwinner in the moment that this is occurring, that he is feeling less than because he can't find a job. He's also changed 9 jobs. And so there's a clear goal for that differentiation of self, as you mentioned, and we spoke about that in our group as one of the treatment goals.
Okay, Laura, can you say a little bit more about the age disadvantage? About using like that term.
In the sense that it doesn't help his inadequacy to feel more leveled, because there is such a huge gap. It's a 20-year gap.
I'm loving all this language that's being used here.
Well, if I were to see it from a zoomed out position, you know, and not a Bohemian lens, probably I wouldn't pay so much attention to the age. However, the mothering that was used, the language that was used as every woman being as a mother figure to him, maybe this is a projection that has occurred, and his tendency to connect with women that feel like they have this position available for him to take, then he connects to them. And not necessarily younger women like him, 23, or older women. However, I don't know if it was a trick age thing that was happening there.
So this is a very real case.
Oh, it's a very real case. Yeah. So maybe there has been a little family projection on unintentionally finding this motherly figure as a spouse, as a partner to choose. Maybe that's a comforting position that he has allowed himself to feel comfortable in.
Okay, thank you, Juliana. Denise.
Well, I think it goes both ways, right? As we look at it, and we were talking about it in our group, we were talking about how Jay may have felt the same way, because if we look at Kay and her daughter's age, they're really around the same age. And she's so used to being like that caretaker for like mom when, you know, there was physical abuse, with grandma, with her daughter, and now her husband. So we talked about kind of like fixing projects.
Sure.
And so that differentiation of self wasn't, it's like very enmeshed. Like she wants to be with him, but she wants him to be independent, which she's grown to be. And he unfortunately is very codependent. So I think that's where this issue like arises. So I'm just looking at the opposite end too.
Okay. What informed you to say he's codependent?
Going back to like the motherly, him wanting, you know, him looking for that, wanting that. I think also, you know, them being supported by her, him not really looking for a job, kind of just being there, wanting to be taken care of. And, you know, when we were looking at the genogram, this is something I pointed out at the end, there was like a lot of things happening on Kay's side, and she's, you know, okay right now, quote unquote. But then there wasn't anything going on Jay's side, and now everything's on Jay's side. So I think Jay's looking for someone to like take care of him and comfort him and fix all of that for him. Hence why I think like there's a codependency on Kay. I
Okay,
may be mixing up the names, but you know what I mean.
sure. Thank you. Justine, and then Yi, and then Sarah.
First of all, Caitlin made a really good point in our group saying like, we should let him grow up because he is only 23. So it makes sense why he wants to be mothered. But on a more serious note, yeah, I think we got carried away in discussing the differentiation of self because we read each of the bullet points on the case study you provided. And it's almost like within those two, there's like the pursuer and the withdrawer, and they almost look like they're, like we talked about in class, like emotional cutoff versus very reactive. And they both present on opposite presenting symptoms of being poorly differentiated. Like on the one hand, Ken is reactive, while we called them Ken and Jane because we kept getting confused.
Sure.
But Ken is reacting and Jane is withdrawing. So in a sense, they are both lowly differentiated, presenting with different symptoms.
Yep.
Also, in terms of like all the things you brought in, such as like trust, financial stability, and just all the familial stuff, it also shows a lack of differentiation within those facets in their relationship, which is expressed through the triangles you've shown in the diagram at the bottom.
Great. And yeah, and so to punctuate what you're saying, Justine, complementarity is a big piece of this approach as well. Yeah. So the pursuer, distancer, the overachiever, or overfunctioner, underfunctioner, those all play a role in this.
We were confused about one point though that we were talking about. I think in the second to last paragraph, it says that, hold on, let me pull this up. It says they have stated that their relationship began as mentor-mentee and then grew into something deeper. Kay has stated that he thinks Jay links him with her deceased grandmother in a symbolic way. And we were very confused about that because we were not sure what the link was.
I can't remember exactly what it was, but I mean, if you go ahead, George, or okay. So many, are you responding?
Well,
to
no,
that?
in my group, we had an answer to that, but I don't want to jump the queue. So I think, who's next, E or Sarah? And then we can come back to that if you want.
Yeah. You go. Sorry.
Yeah, I just want to add on what Denise just shared, like despite those interpersonal part of differentiation, the need for differentiation, like the woman is like the caregiver as always to grandmother, to daughter, and to other people, like she's running this like shelter, like her place is like a shelter. And also for Kay, I think there's the intrinsic part that he cannot differentiation from the thoughts and the feelings, like intellectual system and the feeling system we talk about. And also like between them, because of that, like they are very fused as a couple. So I think there's a lot of need for differentiation, like from the outside part and from within.
Absolutely. Thank you. Sarah.
Okay, I want to try to tackle this grandma thing. Okay, so this is what I'm thinking. So I'm sensing some intergenerational projection. Multi-generational projection process.
Intergenerational
right?
transmission process.
Intergenerational transmission process. Okay, so is Kay the girl or the guy? Hold on.
I think Kay is the woman.
Kay's the guy. Ken.
Right. Ken.
Oh yeah, Ken and Jay.
Okay.
Raise your hand if you had a hard time with the name. Right?
Oh, JK. Okay. So Jay, had an abusive relationship with her stepfather. He was very abusive physically towards her. She fused with grandma, who was sort of like her protector, right? She
Absolutely.
also has this rape. Yeah, she also has this rape that has occurred.
Mm-hmm.
So when grandma passes, that fusion has to go somewhere else. So who's she going to fuse with? She's going to fuse with Kay to be her protector, right? But he's not able to do that because he's not differentiated. Like he's a child, right? So that conflict, that anxiety is really probably goes back to her stepfather. And right. Oh, I think I got lost somewhere, but am I on the right track? So he's taking the place of fusion with grandmother.
Right. And she's expecting potentially the same type of care that she received from her grandmother. And that's a unique relationship that can't be replicated in her romantic relationship. So even if he were to do exactly what she received from her grandma, it wouldn't be received the same either. So that's the issue with the transmission process is, even if you want it, because by virtue of it being another person, it won't function in the same way. But yeah, great consolidation of all of that, Sarah. Thank you. George, was that the answer that your group kind of came up with about grandma as well?
That was essentially it. But we were also thinking about, did she glom onto him so quickly in order to avoid processing her grief as fully as she might have done?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So there was that, and we were thinking about, in terms of an intervention, maybe something where she goes back and works out this unfinished business with grandma and, says a better goodbye to her.
Sure. And remember, techniques, thank you for that, George. Techniques can be used with people who are no longer living. It just will look like a letter. It will, one of the things in the Family of Origin book that was an example was videotaping yourself talking to that person, and then potentially, if you want to, sharing that with your therapist or watching that back, but just having the opportunity to have that conversation, at least your side of that conversation, to allow it to process from coming out of your mouth or off of your fingertips. Yes. Yeah, Marcy, like empty chair. Okay, so super quick, I know we're over time. How was the timing of this? Would you like for the application of a case study, did you feel like you had enough time to go through some of the cues? Did you feel like there's a lot of concepts. So just wanting general feedback on the amount of time that we spent with the case study today.
I felt like it was more than enough time to discuss.
Oh, great. Okay, good. So having that last 45-ish minutes to do this, what about the amount of time of us coming back together? Would you like some more time with a big group?
Yeah, this feels a little rushed.
Okay. All right. Fair.
Because I really, when you said this is a real case, I thought, oh, this is your case. What did you do with this couple?
This is a supervisee's case. And unfortunately, I was only able to supervise her for the first 3 or 4 sessions. So there, as you can see, a lot going on with this case. So I'm confident that she's probably still working with them. So sorry, George, maybe a disappointing response to that. It is what it is. Okay, so next week we will be hearing from Sarah, Marcy, Laura, and Tiffany. And I think, so I don't know, here's my thought with all of you presenting is that we potentially stay online for your presentations for continuity. Because I don't know how many people will be in class, if there'll be some hybrid stuff. So does that sound okay? So on the odd weeks of class, we'll just be online. And then the even weeks when I lecture, we can be in class if I ever get clearance to go onto campus. Okay, and I'll keep communicating with you so there's not hopefully a ton of confusion. All right, thank you so much, everybody. I will see all of you next Tuesday.